Hello and welcome to the BLSI Philosophy and Psychology series. My name is Andreas Wasmuht. I'm the convener for philosophy at the BLSI here in Bath. And today's topic is a very somber topic in the current time of coronavirus COVID-19. And the conversation I will be having today is about death and dying and society. And I would like to welcome Dr. John Troyer, the director in the Center for Death and Society at Bath University, for the two of us to have that conversation. Welcome to you, John.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
I mean, maybe we can start with you giving a bit more background into yourself and the work you're doing in Bath, and the kind of explorations you have done in terms of publications surrounding death, dying, and society.
Sure. The Center for Death and Society was founded in 2005 at the University of Bath in the Department of Social and Policy Sciences. It is an interdisciplinary study center, and what we work on are all topics related to death, dying, and the dead body. We remain the world's only interdisciplinary study center. There are other centers that work on different aspects of death and dying or human mortality, but we genuinely look across the spectrum that would include death, dying, and then the dead body itself. My own work, which started in the U.S., where I'm originally from, I did all my academic work in the States, was on the dead body and the handling of the human corpse and what human corpses can tell us about both human uh, beliefs, but also what are funerals. I mean, there's a long list of areas that this becomes important. And I came to the university in 2008. Yeah, wow. And I've been director since 2015. And, one of the areas of work I work on a lot is around the ideas of technology in the dead body, or how, how technology is used by humans to
Right.
augment or change the dead body. And that can go into different areas like bioethics, but also the history of science and technology, also philosophy. I have a new book that's coming out that my publisher would be remiss if I didn't mention, which is the MIT Press is putting out my new book, Technologies of the Human Corpse. And in Technologies of the Human Corpse, they look at a broad sweep of different concepts around technology and how it has impacted the dead body.
Okay. I mean, we talked a bit earlier about sort of attitude to death and the process of dying, and how that sort of may be slightly different in different cultures. And I seem to suggest that actually, maybe in the West we regard this a bit as a taboo. We push that away much from our thought as possible. And you seem to suggest that actually maybe it's not quite like that. So maybe can you give me a sort of summary of the attitude towards death and dying as you see it in the West, first of all, and then maybe.
Yeah, I mean, I think so. We're all familiar with the death taboo argument, and I think in many ways, the death taboo argument, the popularization of it starts in the 1970s. Um, in the it's an odd history which I could go into at much detail, but I won't because I think it deserves its own discussion. But in the 1970s, you find an emergence across the West of a lot of different social movements, death as a social movement interested in death and dying topics. And a lot of this builds on the back of hospice care that had started in the mid to late 60s, and this idea that hospice was a place you would go to die. And that was a radical suggestion, or end of life was an end of life space. That was a radical suggestion.
Mm.
Um, and so you have these social movements that are interested in drawing attention to death. And so this is when you begin to see the right to die movements or the death with dignity movements, as well as a natural death movement, which wants to advocate not using life support technology, because in the 1970s we suddenly become much better at sustaining or keeping a person
Yeah.
alive through life support, and that's a huge technological change, as well as medical change, that has profound philosophical questions around, like, well, what is death now? What is the
Mm.
definition of death? Um, so, in an effort for social movements to find something to fight against, a lot of it came down to, we're going to use the taboo because it's the best foil.
Right.
And it's the one that everyone knows. Although you can make the case that since that time, we've been talking about death and dying kind of nonstop in lots of different ways. Now, the reason that it gets, I think the taboo argument becomes useful is because it's useful in a society where we're not confronted by death on a daily basis and in a way that requires us to at least uh, imagine having those conversations or thinking them through. So what I've always said is I don't think there's so much a taboo as we in the West have just gotten out of practice. We're not confronted with death and dying in the way that not even so much long ago in the 20th century or in the developing world. It's just a much more everyday phenomenon in a
No,
way that it's not.
no, exactly. I mean, obviously, and also presumably, attitude towards death and dying has changed within the West over the centuries.
Yeah,
Presumably,
absolutely. Yeah,
when you were in the Middle Ages and you were faced with the plague and things like that, then this was a daily occurrence, and the way
sure.
you reacted to all of this must have been very different to how we do
Sure.
this today.
Yes, and I think, and one of the key differences, of course, will always be the shift in religious belief to secular belief. So,
Right.
for many centuries, you could simply say it was God's will, which is that's a very good blanket rationale for why
Yeah.
someone died. But now, it would be you'll still hear that argument. To be clear, you will still hear why did this person die? It was God's will. That is by and large not the if you will, the status quo. If someone dies, we want to know why. Um, and I think so. The reason I'm really interested in how the taboo argument is playing out right now is because in the current moment, if you will, which who knows how long, this could be one of those long moments um, around something like the coronavirus and COVID-19, but also pandemics in general. It suddenly becomes um, quite urgent to have conversations around death and
Yeah.
dying. And this is when I think the taboo becomes exposed as not really being there. It's just that it suddenly becomes obvious we need to have these conversations, and people will and do. Now, some won't, but I think many more are. And I'm not saying it's a simple thing to do. It's not,
No.
but it's also something that needs to be done. And I think there's a certain recognition of this. Why? Well, because there's an understanding that the if you will normal expectations for living and dying have
Yeah.
have changed.
Mm.
And we've seen this before. We've seen this. I do work on the history of the AIDS epidemic in the West,
Right.
more in the West than not. And speaking with colleagues who also work on the history of AIDS, many of us um, are seeing both significant differences, but also enormous similarities. And I think what I find in a way, both I expected this, but also slightly depressing without being sounding too depressed about it, which I'm not. But that it really, I'm struck by how little seems to have been remembered from the AIDS epidemic,
Right.
both at a lot of different levels, just in terms of social,
Mm.
reactions. But again, they're different viruses,
Yeah.
different population. It's a different situation, but there are similarities. My
Yeah.
point is simply that the death taboo is always around, and it's always useful when it's useful until it's not.
Yeah.
Until
Uh,
suddenly we're like, well, no, now we got to talk about this right now. And I think that's when you begin to see that it's around, but it's just not it's not as concrete. I
right.
think it's
Okay.
not explained.
Okay, no, that's helpful. I mean, before we go into the East and the attitude of to death and dying there, obviously being American yourself, I mean, you obviously will have seen potentially differences in the UK versus the US in terms of attitudes to death. I mean, is there something marked, or is there something significant, or is it just very similar?
Well, it depends. I mean, it's so the U.S. and the U.K. are similar ish. I mean, and there have been different cross comparison studies. I did a comparative analysis with a colleague of mine, Candy Can, who's down in Baylor University in Texas, for a journal article a few years ago, and we were just interested in differences to approaches around um, discussions around death, but also the history of death education. I mean, different points like that. And so, what we what we found were, I think that there are definite differences in what we might describe as foundational things like funerals. So,
Right,
for example, in America, it's much more common for families who want to or do have a funeral in a funeral home to see the deceased in an open casket or
right,
open coffin, and that seeing the dead body, for everyone to see it, not just immediate family, that is much more of a cultural norm
Right.
than it would be in the UK. Now that does happen, for example, in parts of Ireland and
Mhm.
even parts of Scotland, but certainly in England, um, to an extent, Wales, that's not the practice. And so, and I think that's just one key difference. As far as other differences, the cremation rate in the UK is much higher, for example. So the cremation rate is about 76, 77% in the UK. In the US, it is just below or just above 50% right now. But then some
Yeah.
states are very high. So of course, in the states, one of the big differences is you have all the states. So you effectively have 50 different systems.
Yeah.
Um, and you also can have wildly different cultural practices that you do also then find in the UK. So I think that when we talk about a British funeral, when you say that, you also need to keep in mind, well, there is an Afro-Caribbean British funeral. There's a
Yeah.
British Jewish funeral, a British
Yeah.
Muslim funeral, British Hindu funeral. And so you do find those cultural groups in the States as well. Um, there are differences. I mean, I'll give you one practical, technical one. There's much more embalming of the dead that's done in the U.S. than is done in the U.K.
Right.
That's just a historical practice that's
Right.
developed. So there are differences, but they're not, which I think some people would find both shocking, but also possibly shocking,
Right.
but also quite normal in some ways. So
Yeah.
so the
Okay.
answer is yes, they're different.
There are
I could
some.
go on and on a long list, but I think
Yeah.
those are the ones you would see.
Okay.
Yeah.
I mean, how does our attitude to death influence the way we live our lives?
Well, that's a great question. I mean, I think that's the classic question, and this goes back philosophically. Actually, this is a long-standing philosophical tradition
Yeah.
around like what is the meaning of life and what is the meaning of death and how do we think about going all the way back. Of course, we could go back to the Greeks if we wanted to. However, we want. I think that for me, what I've always found striking is the 17th century moment in which you have people like Spinoza. Um, but also Descartes, and I don't think we don't really read Descartes much in terms of how he thinks about the life and death questions, although they're certainly on his mind because
Yeah.
he's acutely aware of what's happening to Galileo in terms of Galileo's concepts of a heliocentric versus a geocentric, which
Yeah.
certainly put his own life on the right. And so, I mean, you find these, in a 17th century moment, you find these deeply philosophical questions that suddenly can put your life at risk, which I think absolutely plays a role. I think we should never forget that. But I think in the case of Spinoza, what I've always found so interesting in his book, The Ethics, is he has this great just amazing moment where he talked, I'm paraphrasing here, where he talks about how, the free man thinks nothing less than of death. And in this thinking, he thinks, of course, of living, right? He's not thinking about dying, he's thinking about living. And so I think that there's always been a kind of continuum, uh, uh, perhaps a breakable continuum, but nonetheless a relationship between the concept of living and dying, but then death and life. What I would also say is I think that it's a lot easier in certain economic and social situations to spend your time thinking about those things. So
Yes.
for this has become very acute for me right now, coming back to the idea of what's happening around COVID-19. There are a lot of people who have lost their jobs, right? And there are a lot in the US and the UK, around the world and globally. And if they're not able to secure some kind of financial assistance, whatever that might be, this will create very material problems and difficulties and urgencies that will only exacerbate, I think, questions around mortality and living and dying. And I already have epidemiology colleagues who are interested in looking at concepts around, suicide and self harm, and do we or don't we see any increase in suicide levels around here. And what I would say is I think that there's another tangent to the living and dying questions, which is what is the livability of life? And that this is actually something that Judith Butler, who's a contemporary philosopher, has really been at the forefront on, like, what do we consider a livable life?
Mm.
Uh, and that to me, I think, is going to become an even more urgent question now, for lots of different reasons, not just economic. I think they'll find people. And so I think that when we think about living and dying, I think that having a healthy sense of mortality is
Yeah.
always for the best. And I think generally, and this is how I would always explain it to my students. I teach a final year unit called Sociology of Death for
Yeah.
University of Bath students, which, in case any of your viewers are wondering, is very popular, not because of me, but because the topic is very popular.
Yeah.
And we talk about, like, what is death?
Yeah.
And I think once they start to get their heads around thinking through, how do I understand my own mortality in these questions, to a person, they all say, because I have to write about these, I make them write every week
Yeah.
about it very cruelly, like, you have to write about these questions. They'll say, it's so interesting to me how I think now differently about what I do every day, because I just have this new sense of my mortality, and I'm okay with it. Like, I'm not afraid of it.
No, I mean
uh
it takes you back to a German philosopher called Heidegger, and he seems to suggest exactly what you're saying. Is you need to face up to death, the
yeah,
concept of death, and then you lead a slightly different life. And certainly it seems to be, when Boris Johnson in the UK has just come out of hospital, and
right,
he seemed to be talking very differently, in terms of the kind of care he had, and
yeah,
talking openly about, this could have gone either way.
yeah,
But the point you made earlier about how people feel about a livable life. I mean, broadly in the UK, people have been supportive of this sort of government intervention in terms of guaranteeing income and the
right.
self-employed, etc. So, but how is that playing out in the US?
Well, I mean, they're very, yeah, no, this is a great question. They're very different. These are very different questions, and the welfare state, mechanisms in both countries are very different. And I thought about this right away. So in the UK, there are systems in place, although that system has been, certainly, both expanded, but also, I think, already a system that had problems pushed to its limit in how it responds to people, but nonetheless has been funded. The U.S. is much more different. I mean, just in terms of scale of population, I mean, you've just got
Yeah,
millions and millions of people who are filing now for this money, and that is not something that the United States government has historically done for a long time. It's unclear what will happen. I mean, I think what will happen, there's a further issue here too. I think very specifically related to COVID-19, and I've spoken to my parents about this quite a bit.
mm,
One of the key differences between the UK and then, let's say, the first world, the Western world, but actually across a lot of the world and the United States,
mm,
is, you don't have healthcare guaranteed in the US in any
yeah,
capacity. And what no one has talked about, and I've been really surprised by this, because the TV coverage has been nonstop around COVID-19, which is true in
yeah,
the UK. The medical bills for ICU treatment in the US
yeah.
are the highest, right? And I say this from experience. My father was in an ICU for 2 weeks, and then a hospital for another week, in late November and then December, because of a cardiac arrest. He's fine. He's home.
Oh, good, good.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. No, he's it was, but as Boris Johnson had said, it was very touch and go.
Yeah,
Nonetheless, exceptional care, saved his life. There's no question about that. I was here for that. That's another thing. We were able to go to the hospital, right? You
right.
can't do that now. It's a whole
Yeah,
other issue. Nonetheless, the total bill for his hospitalization was something like 425,000 US dollars. Yeah. Yeah. Now, because my parents are over the age of 65, they qualify in the United States for something that's called Medicare. And
right.
Medicare is a government run national healthcare program that all people who are over 65 automatically get.
Okay.
And they had wisely selected different programs attached to it. They have some disposable income. So they've ended up having to pay about 1,300 US dollars out of that total bill.
Right.
And for them, that's not an economic problem, right? For some people, even 1,300 would be a problem.
Yeah,
The whole reason I'm going through all these numbers is this: if you even cut that 425,000 in half, let's just say it's
yeah,
200,000, something like
yeah,
that, how that gets paid is unresolved.
yeah,
And if you're a person whose employment was connected to your health insurance, or your health insurance was connected to your employment, you've just
yeah,
lost that.
yeah,
And my this is more than an economic question. Going forward, I have no idea what's going to be done about the billions, if not trillions, in new healthcare debt that's going to be accumulated, and
Yeah.
what that's going to do to the quality of life, but also just the anxiety people have about this. And I think that the economic questions necessarily need to be tied to the questions of livability,
Yeah.
because if what happens is you now have to spend the rest of your life with hundreds of thousands of dollars of debt that will never be repaid,
Yeah.
then how does that impact how you think about what I do every day? And there's gonna have to be, I personally, I think, and I don't know, I am optimistic by nature, but I also am
Mm.
realistic. I would hope that there would be a conversation, and a necessarily important political one and policy one in this country, about finally creating a sustainable kind of healthcare program that, while imperfect, at
Yeah.
least does something to ameliorate these causes, because that to me is actually going to be really key. If anything comes out of situations like pandemics, it can be changes like that, maybe.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? I mean,
No, no.
I think what's gonna happen in the UK. Very quickly, one thing I hope what comes out of the UK situation, having, watching both countries simultaneously, is I really hope finally there is an understanding that you do need to fund something like the NHS
Yeah.
to make it possible. Least of which, because when you have an emergency, you need it funded.
Yeah.
And I say this as someone who has participated in UK pandemic planning strategies over
Yeah.
the years.
Yeah.
And the reason we did those was in case you had a pandemic.
Yeah.
And I don't. It to me is that was more on what happens when you have like a lot of people dying. But part of me also wants to know, and we'll find out I think later. But I've started asking now. Part of me wants to know what happened to all those plans, because they don't seem to be being followed right now, and I'm not entirely sure why, but we'll find out, I'm sure.
No, no, absolutely. And I think one of the things that hopefully will happen, as you suggest, is that the NHS will quite rightly rise in the esteem of the British public, but hopefully also in the eyes of the British politicians, whichever party they're from. I think is
Yeah,
hopefully
yeah,
one outcome. I think the other thing that seems to be pretty obvious to people is that actually the plans that have been in place, either by government or even in the corporate sector in terms of supply chains, are plans that are plans, not something that necessarily can be implemented very easily. And I think that hopefully will be another thing that people will look at long and hard. It's all well and good having a plan, but
right,
unless you can enact the plan,
yeah.
you really need to move forward. But no, that's been very insightful. Thank you very much for that, John. In terms of bringing it more sort of closer to home, I mean, how can individuals come to terms with the death of a loved one around us? I mean, this is obviously a much more pressing issue now
Yeah.
because this isn't something that's happening at the end of life. These are things that are happening right here, right now, and most people will know someone who's been affected by COVID-19.
Sure, sure. I think so. There's a concept which I think is very useful in grief and bereavement research, and that is the idea of, well, there's two concepts. There's many concepts. I'm going to stick with two for right now.
All right.
One is complicated grief, in which you have a grief and bereavement situation which is made more complicated or complex by different social dynamics. The classic example of that is a death attributed to a drug overdose. And I have a colleague, Christine Valentine, who's worked on that quite a bit, about families and how they disclose or don't disclose that someone has died from a drug overdose. And in many instances, you have families who actually would prefer to say the individual committed suicide as
Right.
opposed to saying that it was
Oh,
a drug overdose. They would prefer the stigma of suicide to
yeah.
drug overdose. Not all the time, but sometimes. That's a more extreme case. What I would say is we're heading into a prolonged period of complicated grief,
Mm.
where the dynamics of what are going on are making what we would call the dying or the grieving process all the more complicated. Restrictions on funerals are going to make things complicated for a long time, or changes to funerals,
Yeah.
changes to access to individuals who are dying, uh, make that more complicated. I also would say that there's going to be a real surge in what is often referred to as survivor's guilt, particularly in the medical community, in the healthcare community, but across the board, are people who will just wonder why I was the one who was allowed to live while this person died, and that is both, and that is in any kind of traumatic event, a classic scenario. We've seen study after study done around the AIDS epidemic, for example, on that
Yeah.
one. The other area I would say that I think is very important with this is continuing bonds, which is, and this is a very long-standing idea, that even after a person dies, you continue to have a bond with them, and that can mean everything from. And some people will say, "Well, I don't want to say this out loud because I sound like I'm crazy." You're not. Like, I still hear their voice, I still talk to
Yeah.
them, I still have their some piece of clothing, but you continue to have a
Yeah.
bond. Like, once they're dead, it's not as if they've just evaporated into nothingness. They might not physically be there, but they're still around. And so I think as we go forward with grief and bereavement, a lot of how we in the West have come to expect, however we expect the situation to unfold, it's being challenged, and it's being challenged by classic regulatory state
Yeah.
points, which are in some ways necessary. So I mean, I took yesterday. I found it. I was intrigued and a little bit nonplussed, if that's perhaps the best term to use, when the health secretary Matt Hancock was talking about, families have a right to be with the person who's dying, which I completely agree with. And this was more around care homes versus
Yeah.
hospitals, but for very clear reasons, there need to be restrictions on entry and exit into these facilities, least of which around concerns around carrying of the coronavirus, which I get. However, these points have been raised before, and indeed, there's a long history of families having to visit someone in a hospital or visit someone in a care home who has an immunosuppressive disorder, some kind of disorder, or concerns about the families having something that could be potentially contagious. So what do? You have the families gown up in PPE, personal
Yeah.
protective equipment. And so that's been the longstanding issue. So the issue hasn't really so much been, or isn't necessarily, do you have a plan for families to visit people? Most places will have those plans. The issue comes back to, do they have are there enough is there enough access to what is required to where to do that? And so this is where I think we get into another, like, it becomes a planning issue that can be diverted into a grief and bereavement issue, which is very real. But
Yes.
that if you keep in mind that access to the dying, access to people who are at an end of life moment will change given the dynamic of a pandemic, then
Yeah.
you can actually, in a sense, plan for that. But whether or not that's done becomes the issue. So that will absolutely make things difficult for people going forward. And I know that, and there's no way around that. And I think that you'll have, I'm sure, and I've already seen this term used, you'll have what are referred to probably as like COVID families,
Yeah.
or COVID deaths. How long that lasts as a category, who knows? I mean, we in the West tend to like to name our families during different events. The immediate one I would think of would be something like the 9/11 families,
Yeah.
someone who lost someone that way. So in the middle of it, it can be tricky to see, because how the history is written is not really up to us in the
No.
moment. It's all
No.
going to change as it goes forward.
No. Absolutely not. I mean, obviously, the way to say goodbye though is very difficult at the moment. People
Yeah,
are on a phone screen,
yeah,
you know,
yeah,
and
no.
saying goodbye. And I think that's a very different psychological sort of state of being. You're not with your loved ones.
Yeah, I mean, that to me, that's both personal, because I had my younger sister died in
Oh,
July 29th of 2018. She had brain cancer and died. And so I've been through this as on a personal level. And I saw her a couple of weeks before she died. She was actually in Italy. She was in a hospice in
right.
Italy when she died. And so actually wasn't there when she died, but I got there that same night. But I had seen her, before, before she'd been moved to the hospice. And but she did have a lot of friends and family come to see her in the hospice and spend a lot of, her husband in particular, time with her before she died. And so I think that so I in a very, very,
Yeah.
very very, very real way, I understand the just deep uh, pain that could cause for a lot of people. but also too, I was mentioning my dad was in the hospital. He was in the hospital, and then he was in a transitional care facility for a month. And my mom and I were with him every day.
Yeah.
And if that had been restricted, I know we both would have found that really, maddening. Um, but so, but the problem is I get it. Like I understand why it's being done.
Yeah.
Now, will this create long-term, long-run problems, difficulties for people? I think for some people it will. I think if you can say anything about the history of funerals, in particular, but also grief and bereavement, is that humans have adapted, and we have adapted with technological changes, and it's really only been in the 20th century because of mass transport that we've really been able to get everyone together for a funeral. And it was not uncommon for someone to die and you didn't know for many, many years, just because there wasn't the communication we had. We didn't have the ability to return for the funeral. So I think that there will be there's always a moment of shock whenever any
Sure.
new technology is used in death and dying practices. And by new, I mean it's just a technology we don't think of using in that way. So the shock right now is the idea that we can use our pedestrian everyday phones, pedestrian everyday tablets to talk to someone who's dying.
Yeah.
And I think that it is that shock that becomes over time part of the normalized set of tools we would just use in these situations. And so that, I mean, it is, I'm not diminishing it, but I think it is one of those ways to think through what's going on right now.
Yeah. And obviously, apart from the loss of a loved one, there's the whole grieving and remembrance process that people go through. I mean, maybe we can sort of explore that from an Eastern perspective, because there's a lot around the grieving process, but also the remembrance process, and in religious terms or in Eastern traditions. Maybe you can talk to that, John.
Sure. I think I mean, different countries across what we might think of as East Asia have different practices, and so there's similarities but differences. So things that happen differently in Japan to China to different parts of like South Korea or Taiwan, or how different ways. And I've done a lot of work in China, but what I would say is, and speaking with colleagues there certainly is a lot of, remembrance of the deceased, and also expectations about who cares for the deceased or who cares for someone who's older, which I think is normal. What I would say, interestingly enough, is particularly in China, the work we've done in China, my colleagues and I have done mostly in Shanghai, but also in Beijing. There's a significant number of both care, grief and bereavement support, but also medical people, but also academics and sociology working around ideas of end-of-life care and end-of-life planning in China. And a lot of it is actually very similar to the West, not similar in a way that they're similar. There are differences, but a lot of the concerns are the same. Like it's not, they're not that different. What I would say is, for example, how the rituals are performed is itself different. And I'll give one example of how actually Japan adapted to its own catastrophic event that I think in some ways might give the UK or the US some guidance with COVID, or Europe or the rest of the world, which is in 2011 up in Japan had the massive earthquake and tsunami, and I'm sure people remember seeing the waves coming across and just wiping out large chunks of Japan. And the first thing I thought of actually when I saw the waves come across was that's going to knock all the crematoria offline, and that's going to be a real issue, because the cremation rate in Japan is 99%, and they won't be able to cremate, and they couldn't. And so what the Japanese government did was they did temporary interments. They had burials, which was not the practice. And they had the military dig graves. Individuals had identificatory materials attached both to their body, but then also to the top of it was a simple wooden coffin. Those coffins were then laid out, and there are photos of this being done. And what the Japanese government said is, we will do this for a year, and then after a year, perhaps quicker if we can do it quicker, but after a year, we will then exhume the remains so that we can cremate the bodies and you can have the proper ceremony involving the children, because that was a key step with that. And that's more or less what happened. And I think that it was necessary to do that because it was clear trying to do the normal practice wasn't possible. So they had to come up with an idea of here is a temporary solution to give us time to get to what is the normal practice. And I think that in these situations in which we find these challenges, there are always ways for people to think around and through
Sure.
The obstacles. But I think that there just has to be an understanding that, at least for a time, things will just have to change. And I think that's why this is how I think, in many ways, the concept of death always befuddles us humans, or challenges us in many ways, because it's dynamic, it's not static.
Yeah.
And I think for a lot of us, we prefer to think of death as a sort of static, kind of concrete idea, and it's not. Dying isn't, right? I wouldn't even say, I would go so far as to say I don't think the dead body is particularly static.
No.
Although I've argued with colleagues about that. I see it as a much more dynamic kind of entity. And so I think it is that always changingness of death and dying, but always the possibility of changing this too, that I think for a lot of us becomes one of the key challenges, because we just don't think of it that way.
No, well, thank you, John, for that. I mean, the final question, if I may, and that is because coronavirus and COVID-19 is so ubiquitous across the globe. How do you feel society will move on from COVID-19 in terms of its attitude towards death going forward?
Well, yeah. Excuse me. It's this is a good question. I've talked with a number of journalists and other people about this, because I'm not cynical about this, but every time I hear how everything will never be the same again, that to me always, I wonder if that's the case, because I've been through enough mortality events where everything will be different, and things have changed, but they aren't necessarily that different. So can things change? Yes. So for example, what is one of the things that came out of the AIDS epidemic, particularly in America, but then really spread around the West? Well, one of the things that came out of that was same-sex marriage. Yeah. And the reason you got same-sex marriage, or the idea of two people of same sex being married, was because what AIDS made abundantly clear, if it wasn't already, was that unmarried, non-married, non-spouses had no real legal rights at times over anything to do with medical care, but then, add insult to injury, had no legal claim to the dead body,
right,
and could be excluded from the funerals, and often were.
Yeah.
So what do you need? You need legal representation that says, yes, these two are married. And so that's one of the things over the years that comes out of it. So when we think about what comes out of now, it will be many decades, and it may not be a direct, if you will, causation, but there will definitely be a relationship. Yeah. In the medium term, how do things change now? Well, we're not sure. I mean, I think one thing I've noticed is, and it's become both a joke that is, to use the language of the day, like funny but not funny, which is, health disparities in America amongst different communities. It's just been, which were already there, and it's just been made abundantly clear. But also, I think health disparities in the UK amongst different communities, and I think in some ways the comment on that has been, and it only took a global pandemic to make people kind of look at it. So I think that if it's possible to remember that these events were happening, and these disparities and these inequalities were brought out, then that is good. How it happens, I don't know.
Okay.
I don't know.
Okay, no, but I think that's a good lesson to draw from all of this, is that how we react and respond to what is happening and what will have happened in the months to come is going to be a defining moment for all of us. So, John, thank you very much for taking the time to have the
Absolutely.
conversation
Thank
with
you.
us today. It's much appreciated. And
Thank you.
to the BLSI audience who will be watching this particular interview, you can find much more of this on the BLSI website, and the address is www.blsi.org, where you will find material like this, but also other materials on subjects and topics ranging from antiquity to world affairs. So please tune into blsi.org, and I hope to see you all very soon.